so not quite as much as last week. And Lee, you guys may know, Lee said Terry's back in the hospital, so pray for Terry again. And Caleb and his family got left this morning about 7:30 or so they're on the road. On the road again, all the way back to Tokyo. So, yeah, if the plane's overloaded, it'll be for them. That's for sure. They got a lot of stuff, but
yes.
Caleb does not travel light by any means. But anyway, he's always prepared, I guess. So anyway, they're going to Chicago this morning, and I think their plane leaves at 5:30 or so this evening. So. Okay, well, I am too, because that'd be in the wrong direction. Yeah. Oh.
It's a busy place, isn't
Yeah.
it?
Oh. Who goes to Pigeon Forge on spring break?
There's no beach at Pigeon Forge.
Yeah. Oh, well.
Spring break's supposed to be a beach town.
Anyhow, so I got to bring it back in here.
All right.
So last week, Job was confronted by his three friends, Bildad, Eliphaz, and, he's going to be. Last week it was Eliphaz that spoke first to Job. Again, these three friends come to Job meaning very well. And we probably all know people like that probably mean well, but just really aren't much help. And Eliphaz was the first to speak, perhaps because he's the oldest. Not that that matters, but Eliphaz believed that Job was having all these calamities because of sin in his life that Job hadn't confessed or hadn't shown forth. And so Eliphaz confronts him about his sin that perhaps was secret. I want to continually remind everybody of this. God said that Job was a righteous man. And so we know that it was not sin that caused this affliction to Job. It was God afflicting Job in order to prove Job's faithfulness to Job himself and to Satan, which is the reason for this whole calamity, is to prove to Job and to Satan that Job's faith was real in God, not because of any blessings that God had given Job, but because Job's heart was turned to the true God. So as we begin chapter 6, this is Job's reply back to Eliphaz, and in some way it's back to these other two friends, because while Eliphaz is recorded as being the one talking in chapters 4 and 5, we get the sense from Job that the silence of his two other friends while Eliphaz goes on his diatribe was his two friends agreeing with everything that Eliphaz was saying. And we kind of get that hint by what Job replies back to here. But understand chapter 6 let me say it this way. Chapter 6 is Job's reply back to Eliphaz. And chapter 7 is him replying to Eliphaz and in some ways replying to and talking to God again. And then we get to chapter 8, and we'll read about Bildad being his first speech toward Job. I'm laying this groundwork so we understand the context where we're at today. So in chapter 6, again, this is Job's reply back to his friend Eliphaz and what he had told him, what we read last week in chapters 4 and 5. So with that, we will start. And I will say that this is all, again, the same type of literature that we read about in chapter 3, 4, and 5, and it's a poetic type of literature. So, again, some of this is figures of speech, some of it's exaggerations, and some of this is just not necessarily a narrative as much as it is a poetic type story. And so a lot of this I'm not going to comment again on, make commentary on a verse by verse, but just kind of giving you the overview here of what's being said. So, but again, Job is answering now Eliphaz in verse 1 of chapter 6.
Job 6. But Job answered and said, Oh, that my grief were thoroughly weighed, and my calamity laid in the balances together. For now it would be heavier than the sand of the sea. Therefore my words are swallowed up. For the arrows of the Almighty are within me, the poison whereof drinketh up my spirit. The terrors of God do set themselves in array against me. Doth the wild ass bray when he hath grass, or loweth the ox over his fodder? Can that which is unsavory be eaten without salt, or is there any taste in the white of an egg? The things that my soul refused to touch are as my sorrowful meat. Oh, that I might have my request, and that God would grant me the thing that I long for.
All right, so Job's weighing his calamities. His calamities are greater than the weight of the sand of the sea. He says that in verse 3. So you can feel this despair that Job has. I mean, I think that we could probably, I'll say it this way, of all the Bible people that we read about, we could probably, in some ways, know how Job feels, probably over more than any of the other people that we read about in Scripture. Now, that might be an exaggeration, but you get the understanding that when we're faced with calamity, we kind of feel the same way. Woe is me, or why God, or it can't get any worse. These types of things we've all felt in some way or another. These feelings that Job has. It's like the arrows of God are in me. The poison. It just feels like God has turned his back. But we understand. Job doesn't, but we understand that all this is God's true test of Job's faith. And yes, we read last week how Job wanted to die, and we see here in verse 8, oh, that he might grant me the request. Job wanted for God to kill him, yes. It's God allowing it to happen, yeah. Yes, true, yes. Yeah, but we will see, and I got to thinking about this, because Scripture is clear that Job never cursed God. But I have this feeling that he came pretty close. I mean, really close. So, we don't want to necessarily try to find where that line is, but I think Job got pretty close to crossing the line of cursing God. But we do know from Scripture that he didn't. He never did. But, and that's what we need to understand, too, that when we get in our times of despair and calamity, that we don't get close to the line where we're cursing God and blaming God and shaking our fist at God. Why, God? But I think through all this, we see that Job does feel sorry for himself and wishes that God would take him. But through it all, he never defies God and turns back his faith toward God to where he just gives up. Now, again, I've said last week, Job could have easily killed himself. But he didn't, because of that hope that he has in himself, and I believe the hope that Christians have in themselves, that we're in the hand of God to do with what he pleases. And so he's asking God there again in verse 8, the thing that he asked for is for God to take him. So God knows the end, Job doesn't, but this is Job's plea. And he talks about the wild ass and the oxen. They complain when their food trough is empty, or if they don't have anything to eat. And so should Job be any different than these that complain when things don't go their way? And again, I refer back now to verse 8. Oh, that I might have the request that God would grant me the thing I long for, again, which is for God to take him. So he's feeling the weight of all this and says that the weight I'm carrying is heavier than the sand of the sea. So we can feel for Job here. Notice, let's go to verse 9.
Even that it would please God to destroy me, that he would let loose his hand and cut me off. Then should I yet have comfort, yea, I would harden myself in sorrow. Let him not spare, for I have not concealed the words of the Holy One. What is my strength that I should hope, and what is mine end that I should prolong my life? Is my strength the strength of stones, or is my flesh of brass? Is not my help in me, and is wisdom driven quite from me?
So Job is saying here, if God would only kill me, I would be freed from all this pain and suffering that I have. I'd be freed from that. Where's my strength and my hope? He doesn't have any, other than in the Lord. And again, it's kind of hard for him at this point to fully grasp that. But inside Job somewhere, he knows that God is his only strength and his only hope. And I think perhaps sometimes we have to get to that point to really fully understand how good God really is to us. But he's, again, wishing that God would just take him so he'd be freed from this. Now, beginning in verse 14, he's talking now specifically to Eliphaz here, as we see here. Let's see what verse 14 and following says here.
To him that is afflicted, pity should be shown from his friend. But he forsaketh the fear of the Almighty. My brethren have dealt deceitfully as a brook, and as the stream of brooks they pass away, which are blackish by reason of the ice, and wherein the snow is hid. What time they wax warm, they vanish. When it is hot, They are consumed out of their place. The paths of their way are turned aside. They go to nothing and perish. The troops of Tema looked. The companies of Sheba waited for them. They were confounded because they had hoped. They came thither and were ashamed.
So what Job is saying here is, going back to verse 14, to him that is afflicted, pity should be shown. No pity was ever shown, well, let me say it this way. No pity was shown to by Eliphaz to Job, I said Joseph, when Eliphaz was talking. He essentially was getting in Job's face and pointing at him, saying, you've got sin in your life. This is the reason why you're having these problems. And Job says, shouldn't a guy that's afflicted be getting pity? Have we ever had anybody come to us and they really never did help? They caused more worry and angst than they helped. And I think that's, was Eliphaz. They meant well. And I said this last week. His friends meant well to come and to comfort him, but they offered no comfort. They just pointed at him and said, you're the reason why you're doing this or having these calamities. He says, you've dealt with me deceitfully as a brook. So what he's talking about there is when the summer would come and melt the snow caps, the water would come down the mountains and form rivers, but it wouldn't last all summer. And so by the end of summer, when you really need that water, it's gone because the snow's already melted and the water that was feeding those brooks and rivers dries up. And that's what he's referring to beginning there in verse 16 down to verse 20. The thing that you hope for, it vanishes. It's not there. Similar to a mirage. You're in a desert and you see water up ahead. Well, it's just a mirage. There's no oasis at all. And that's what these friends were to Job. They were of no help. Now, perhaps we could say in some ways they were, because they were there to offer support. But while they were there, they never offered any support. So, their presence perhaps was felt, but their help was not felt. Does that make sense? I hope I'm making sense there. Now, beginning in verse, did I leave off at 20 or 21? Or 21, okay. Well, let's read that and then I'll comment. Verse 21.
For now ye are nothing. Ye see my casting down and are afraid. Did I say, bring unto me, or give a reward for me of your substance, or deliver me from the enemy's hand, or redeem me from the hand of the mighty? Teach me, and I will hold my tongue, and cause me to understand wherein I have erred.
So Job says there, did I ask you to bring me a gift or to bring me anything? No. Did I ask you to deliver me from the enemy's hand or buy me back out of slavery? No. I just wanted you to be there to be a comfort. And all you want to do is point your finger at me, is essentially what Job is saying here. And he says, you've not done anything. Verse 24, teach me, and I'll hold my tongue. Tell me where I have sinned. Tell me what I have done wrong to cause this. He's putting it back now on Eliphaz. You say all these things that I've done wrong, that I have this sin in my life, that I've not been faithful to God. Tell me where I haven't been. Show me. Well, Eliphaz doesn't know, and he has no answer for it. But this is how Job is feeling toward his friend here. You think you have the right words, but you've not said anything helpful at all. Because I think what Job is feeling here as well is, if you would tell me where I've done wrong, or you could show me, then I could correct my error. But again, Eliphaz believes that the only reason Job's got any of these problems is because he sinned. And again, we know that's not to be true. So Job has this reply back because Eliphaz offered no comfort, only accusation. And I suppose we could probably all take some accusation against us if we really had somebody, that was bringing accusation, bring proof of that. But when somebody just accuses you of something that you are not guilty of, it's like stab wounds more than help. And, I think we all want, perhaps in some way, for people, if they do have an accusation, to be truthful about it and to show us proof so that we can correct this. But here, Eliphaz didn't offer any proof. He was just assuming, and that wasn't the correct response to a guy in Job's condition. And we'll see more about Job's condition as we get to chapter 7. But let's finish chapter 6 here.
How forcible are right words! But what doth your arguing reprove? Do ye imagine to reprove words, and the speeches of one that is desperate, which are as wind? Yea, ye overwhelm the fatherless, and ye dig a pit for your friend. Now therefore be content, look upon me, for it is evident unto you if I lie. Return, I pray you, let it not be iniquity. Yea, return again, my righteousness is in it. Is there iniquity in my tongue? Cannot my taste discern perverse things?
Any comments or questions on chapter 6? Yeah, unless you go like that. That's what I would have to do. Oh, well. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and we don't. Yeah. 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 And, you know, Satan's biggest trick is you're not good enough for God. Look at where you failed. You weren't faithful enough. You know, that's Satan's biggest trick. And in some ways, perhaps, you know, Satan is using these three friends to be another dagger in Job's life. Not only is he afflicted physically, but now he's got his friends against him, and perhaps we don't read that God has allowed Satan to use his three friends, but perhaps he has. But these three friends are thinking that they're being a help. And Job has told Eliphaz here in chapter 6, you ain't helping nothing. And so you kind of wonder whether you'd want somebody to show up at your hospital bed if all they're going to do is be an Eliphaz. You know, I'm sure when they showed up, Job was glad that they showed up. But man, after they started talking, they just kind of showed how they truly were. You know, I don't know. I haven't read toward the end, but I wonder how their relationship was after all this. You know, Job may have had to go out and buy him some new friends after all this. Mercy sakes. Anyway, now chapter 7 is the continuation of chapter 6. There's no necessarily any thought break here, other than we perhaps can see Job beginning to take his words toward God in a way, and not necessarily toward Eliphaz, but addressing God more so in chapter 7 here, which we will see how this plays out here. So, chapter 7.
Job 7. Is there not an appointed time to man upon earth? Are not his days also like the days of an hireling? As a servant earnestly desireth a shadow, and as an hireling looketh for the reward of his work, so am I made to possess months of vanity, and wearisome nights are appointed to me.
So keep in mind, not only was Job afflicted, and we'll see this played out here in just the next few verses, physically with these sores and all these things, but he couldn't sleep. But when he did sleep, he had nightmares. And so he couldn't even get rest when he did actually get a little bit of sleep, because he would have these nightmares that we'll see played out here. But he says there in verse 1, is there not an appointed man on earth? I mean, we all have an end. And Job's thinking, my time has got to be close. And again, he's wanting God to take him. We've seen that back here again in chapter 6, verse 8. We also saw that in chapter 3 as well. But he says, the servant desires a shadow. You know, you're out there in the field and always waiting for a cloud to cover the sun for a little bit. You know, it can get a little cooler, perhaps. That's what he's talking about there. But at least a hireling gets a reward. He gets some type of stipend or pay. And Job's thinking, I'm going through all this for nothing. So again, we can see here, and I'd be the same way. I'm probably this way for a lot less stuff. Just being honest. So anyway, verse 4.
When I lie down, I say, when shall I arise, and the night be gone? And I'm full of tossings to and fro unto the dawning of the day.
So, you know, I should have stopped this later. When I lie down, I say, when can I rise? When does, I go to bed. I look forward to going to bed, but I can't get any sleep because I toss around to and fro. When I do fall asleep, I have these nightmares. But then when I wake up, I long to go back to bed. This same back and forth. You're not getting any rest from this torment that he's going in here. Back and forth. Verse 5.
My flesh is clothed with worms and clods of dust. My skin is broken and become loathsome. My days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle and are spent without hope. So
a weaver's shuttle, I looked this up. I didn't know what a weaver's shuttle was. Kind of an interesting little wooden block, but anyway. But essentially what he's referring to, it just goes back and forth, just constantly. There's no change in the way the Weaver shuttle works. It just is back and forth. And this is what Job's saying. My days are like that. It's just back and forth. There's no change. There's no comfort. There's no rest. My days are in torment. My nights are in torment. When I do go to bed, I toss to and fro. When I do doze off, I have nightmares. Yes. Yeah, he's covered in these. And everyone, did Lee give everyone one of these handouts last week? I think so. Oh, yeah, you guys weren't here. Well, I'm sure he was, but I think like good people that are Christian people. I'm not saying you never. I'm not saying that Christians can't kill themselves. That's not who Christians are. I mean, we have this hope of seeing the Lord and allowing our days to be played out by God's timing and not our own. And I just think that's the way typical Christians feel. I understand that the brain and the physical ailments can play on a person and cause them to take their own life at times. But Job was not to this stage where he wanted it to be the one in control of his destiny. He felt like he was in God's hands, and if he was going to die, it was going to be at God's hand and not his own. Now, again, we all have an appointed time, and you're not going to die a second sooner than God has already knows that you're going to die. And I've said a lot of times, you don't jump off the water tower to see if today's your day. Because if today's not your day, you jump off the water tower, you're not going to die. But the rest of your life may not be very fun. But I think, Christians in general have this hope of life and being alive and being a blessing to others on earth. And that's why I think that Job didn't resort to that. Verse 7, Weaver shuttle. So yeah.
Oh, remember that my life is wind. Mine eye shall no more see good.
So here again, Job. Nothing. I'm never going to come out of this. Is what his feeling there. My eye will never see good.
The eye of him that hath seen me shall see me no more. Thine eyes are upon me, and I am not. As the cloud is consumed and vanisheth away, so he that goeth down to the grave shall come up no more. He shall return no more to his house, neither shall his place know him any more. Therefore I will not refrain my mouth. I will speak in the anguish of my spirit. I will complain in the bitterness of my soul.
I feel that way sometimes when I haven't been able to eat on time. Oh, well, we've all been there. We complain in the bitterness of our soul. Things don't go exactly the way, I don't think that we've anywhere been afflicted personally the way Job has, but we all can feel at times where we complain in the bitterness of my soul. Anyway, Job's helpless here, he feels like. But again, understand that through all this anguish, he still has the Lord on his side. Now, he may not feel like it. We've all perhaps felt like it at times where the Lord has turned against us. But I want us to use this calamity toward Job to help us to understand that God is faithful. Even when Job wasn't singing God's praises, we haven't seen that, but God never turned his back on Job. Even though perhaps in some ways Job has perhaps not turned his back to God, but has kind of turned his shoulder. And we're kind of like that too, where we don't always sing the praises of the Lord, though we should. God is still there for us. He's there in the midst of our anguish, just like he is here for Job. So if we don't learn anything else from all this, these 42 chapters, let's remember that God is faithful. Verse 12.
Am I a sea or a whale that thou settest a watch over me? When I say my bed shall comfort me, my couch shall ease my complaint, then thou scarest me with dreams and terrifiest me through visions, so that my soul chooseth strangling and death rather than my life. I loathe it. I would not live always. Let me alone, for my days are vanity. What is man that thou shouldst magnify him, and that thou shouldst set thine heart upon him, and that thou shouldst visit him every morning and try him every moment? How long wilt thou not depart from me, nor let me alone till I swallow down my spittle. I have sinned. What shall I do unto thee, O thou preserver of men? Why hast thou set me as a mark against thee, so that I am a burden to myself? And why dost thou not pardon my transgression and take away my iniquity? For now shall I sleep in the dust, and thou shalt seek me in the morning, but I shall not be.
So it does seem like here that Job is essentially giving up. You know, he's asking God, what is man that you should magnify me? Why is your heart turned toward man? You know, why does God even put up with us? It's because, well, for us, it's because of Christ and what Christ has done. And the sacrifice of Christ has allowed us to be reconciled to God so that God can love us. But Job here just seems to have given up here. And verse 18, and that thou shouldest visit him every morning, talking about why would God come and even come to see us? Keep in mind, God knew Job's name, and God knew that Job was a righteous man all the way back in chapter 1. But here, Job is questioning why even God would even pay any attention to him. He says, I've sinned, and he says there, why haven't you pardoned my transgression? Why haven't you taken away my iniquity? I shall just sleep in the dust. I'm going to just go back to where I came. We're all dust. So Job has kind of given up here to the point where he just tells God, you know, whatever, just I'm in your hand, is what he's saying here in these closing verses of chapter 7. But again, understand, God's faithfulness is true and sure regardless of how you feel. God's faithfulness toward us is not based on our feelings. God's faithfulness is based upon God's faithfulness to us is based upon His word and His promises, not on our feelings. Because at this point, according to Job, God might as well just leave. But God has made promises, and God keeps His word. And so regardless of how you feel, God's promises and word will remain faithful. And we see that here with Job. We'll see that in chapter 42, how this is all played out. We do see here in chapter 8, which we'll get to, a prophecy that was said that we know ends up, because we know how it turns out, we know will come true here. So any questions on chapter 7? We're moving along pretty good here. Do we see the calamity or the anguish that Job has? Not only in his flesh, but toward God. Do we see that? And we ought to pray that we have the strength of Job, but also that we understand the mind of God and that God is faithful to us, even in our anguish. And again, I will say this. We don't know how much time passes from chapter 2 to chapter 42. We don't know how long this was. It would really be nice to know, but God never told us that. So, chapter 8, and we'll be, let's see. Did she bunk her head? Oh, poor baby. Lila's acting like Job here. Woe is me. God's faithful, baby. Chapter 8.
Job 8. Then answered Bildad.
Oh, I forgot to say this. So here's Job's second friend, Bildad, here coming up. So we had Eliphaz mouth off, and Job's answered him back. Now Bildad thinks he's going to come and help, but he doesn't.
Height and said, How long wilt thou speak these things? And how long shall the words of thy mouth be like a strong wind? Doth God pervert judgment, or doth the Almighty pervert justice? If thy children have sinned against him, and he have cast them away for their transgression, if thou wouldst seek unto God betimes, and make thy supplication to the Almighty, if thou wert pure and upright, surely now he would awake for thee, and make the habitation of thy righteousness prosperous.
My goodness. What a guy. Job, if you would just get your life right, God would recognize you, and he would take all these away. God's just. God is just. And if you would just get right, Job, why, God will fix all this. Verse 6, if you were pure and upright, surely he, talking about God, would awake. What? Now again, Job's not necessarily singing the praises of the Lord through all this. But we know Job was a righteous man. And here's Bildad thinking he's really going to help. You know, everybody's got an opinion on what they would do in a certain circumstance. And it's never what you're doing. You know, I mean, no matter how you're handling a circumstance, your buddy always has an opinion on how you should be doing it. And here's Bildad here. Not only was Eliphaz mouthy and talking about how Job had sin in his life, now Eliphaz here, or Bildad saying, hey, if you just get right with the Lord, you wouldn't have any problems. If you were pure and upright, he would awake and make your habitation prosperous. Notice what he says in verse 7. A prophecy here that did come true, but now he didn't know this. Verse 7.
Though thy beginning was small, yet thy latter end should greatly increase.
And we know that to be true. Now, again, Bildad didn't know that, but he's telling Job that if he would just get right, the Lord would awake, he would recognize Job's calamity, and he would bless him greatly. So that did end up coming true, verse 7. Verse 8.
For inquire, I pray thee, of the former age, and prepare thyself to the search of their fathers. For we are but of yesterday, and know nothing, because our days upon earth are a shadow.
So Bildad, inquire and pray for the former age. Look back to how your fathers and the generations prior. This didn't happen to them. Why? And it says there in verse 9, I thought about this yesterday. For we are but yesterday and know nothing. You know, we were at a cemetery yesterday. We went up to Casey, not Casey's Star. And went up, my grandparents are buried there. And, you know, of all these grave markers in this cemetery, I only knew the people underneath my grandparents' headstone. I didn't know anybody else. I'd recognize some last names, but I didn't know those people. Didn't know any of them. And so to me, it's kind of like what Job's friend's saying here. Your life is really basically nothing in the grand scheme of the world. Now, for me, that one head marker means a lot, but none of the others mean anything to me. Now, you know, that may sound cold, but I don't know those people. I don't know of anything they did in their lives. And so, to me, their life, not talking about my but all these other people, they really meant nothing. And in some ways, you know, when you're dead and in the ground, there's only going to be a handful of people that even know that you ever existed. Now, that's sad to say. But when we think about the grand scheme of the entirety of the universe and time and eternity, our life is just a vapor, here and gone. And there's going to come a day when there's going to be no one on earth that even knew who I was. And I think sometimes we begin to think that we're pretty important. Now, we are to some people at this day and age, but there's going to come a time when, you know, there's just a handful of people perhaps that people just know. You know, we all know of George Washington. Okay. Perhaps one day his name will be forgotten. I don't know. But we see here that Job's friend here saying our lives are but yesterday. We know nothing. Our days are just a shadow. And I think sometimes we, perhaps not this crowd, but generally speaking, people think that they're a bigger deal than they really are. And I think, you know, Bildad here is telling Job, you know, you're really not much of anything. And again, he's not really encouraging Job in any way. But I think Bildad is trying to get Job to understand that his life is really just a vapor. Which really, in the grand scheme of things, that's really not a bad thing to tell people. But perhaps not when they're facing these things that Job is. But anyway, I'm off on that rant. But we were at that cemetery yesterday when I read this again this morning and thought, you know, we didn't go there to see anyone else, but that one stone in that probably 1,000 graves there that meant anything to me at all. And it was that way, I'm sure, for anybody that was going through the cemetery yesterday. There were a few people there, but none of them came to look at my grandparents' grave. So anyway, enough of that. Hope everybody understands what I'm trying to say there. Verse 10.
Shall not they teach thee, and tell thee, and utter words out of their heart? Can the rush grow up without mire? Can the flag grow without water? Whilst it is yet in his greenness, and not cut down, it withereth before any other herb. So are the paths of all that forget God, and the hypocrite's hope shall perish. Whose hope shall be cut off, and whose trust shall be a spider's web?
You notice there the underhanded insult that he gives there in verse 13. The hypocrite's hope shall perish. Essentially referring to Job as a hypocrite. Because if you weren't a hypocrite, Job, none of this would have happened. Again, perhaps a good friend, but has bad theology. Verse 15.
He shall lean upon his house, but it shall not stand. He shall hold it fast, but it shall not endure. He is green before the sun, and his branch shooteth forth in his garden. His roots are wrapped about the heap, and seeth the place of stones. If he destroy him from his place, then it shall deny him, saying, I have not seen thee. Behold, this is the joy of his way, and out of the earth shall others grow. Behold, God will not cast away a perfect man, neither will he help the evildoers, till he fill thy mouth with laughing, and thy lips with rejoicing. They that hate thee shall be clothed with shame, and the dwelling place of the wicked shall come to naught.
So he is right there. God will not cast away a perfect man. And again, I refer back to what God said about Job in chapters 1 and 2, that essentially Job was perfect. So Job is not going to be cast away. And in the eyes of God, we are perfect through Christ. God's not going to cast us away. So again, verse 20 is true. And we can put ourselves there because in Christ we are perfect. So 20 through 22 there, even though he may not have realized it, he is, Bildad is telling Job the truth there. But again, he's not helping in any of this. He's accusing more than he's encouraging. So, any comments on chapter 8? Okay. Well, let's be thankful that we haven't had any of this happen to us. Let's be thankful that God is faithful regardless of what we've been through. And let's be thankful that God knows us by name and knows that we are perfect in him.